the eighth pocket of the moon.
605 years before Christ, Babylon was not a city. It was a system. The largest administrative machine the ancient world had ever constructed. A city of more than 200,000 people at its peak, spread across 900 acres on both banks of the Euphrates River, enclosed behind walls so thick that Herodotus would later claim 2 4-horse chariots could pass each other on top of them without touching. Inside those walls, the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in the ancient Near East operated continuously. The Chaldean astrologers, the Tupshar Enuma, Anu, and Enlil, the scribes of the Omen series, named for the gods Anu and Enlil, had been tracking the movements of planets and recording celestial observations on clay tablets for generations. Their astronomical diaries, fragments of which still exist in the British Museum today, represent what historians now call one of the longest continuous research programs ever undertaken by human beings. They tracked the moon, they tracked Mars and Venus and Jupiter and Saturn. They connected celestial patterns to earthly events with the systematic rigor of people who believed the sky was the most reliable data set available to any government. They were not wrong about the data set. They were wrong about what the data meant. And into this system, in approximately 605 BC, walked a 17-year-old Jewish boy named Daniel, taken from Jerusalem, stripped of his name, given a Babylonian identity, Belshazzar, and enrolled in a 3-year training program designed to turn the most intellectually capable captives from conquered nations into operational assets for the Babylonian intelligence apparatus. He would graduate at the top of his class. He would outlast 4 empires. And the methodology he developed inside the most sophisticated intelligence system of the ancient world is the thing that McKinsey has never once put in a case study. Stay with me, because what the book of Daniel describes, when you read it as an intelligence document rather than a prophetic text, is the most precisely documented case of analytical methodology outperforming institutional consensus in the history of ancient administration. And every principle in it applies to the organization you are trying to build right now. Babylon in 605 BC had just defeated Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish under the command of the crown prince Nebuchadnezzar. It was the decisive military event of the ancient Near East, the moment that confirmed Babylon, not Egypt, would be the dominant power of the next century. In the aftermath of Carchemish, Nebuchadnezzar moved south through Judah and reached Jerusalem. He did not destroy it. Not yet. He did something more strategically sophisticated. He took people. Daniel 1:3-4 records the selection criteria with the precision of a modern talent acquisition brief. The king instructed Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, qualified to serve in the king's palace. Read that again. Without physical defect, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, qualified to serve in the king's palace. Nebuchadnezzar was not collecting trophies. He was conducting a talent audit of a conquered nation's intellectual capital and extracting the highest value assets before they could be organized against him. This is the oldest documented case of what modern intelligence agencies call human intelligence acquisition through institutional integration. You do not imprison the most capable minds of a conquered people. You train them, give them resources, give them access, and then you deploy them inside your own system, where their intelligence generates value for you and away from whatever resistance they might otherwise organize. Nebuchadnezzar's program lasted 3 years. The curriculum included the language and literature of the Babylonians, meaning Akkadian, the lingua franca of the ancient Near East, and the cuneiform writing system that encoded everything from commercial contracts to astronomical data to royal correspondence. It included mathematics. It included astronomy. It included the omen literature, the thousands of cuneiform tablets that constituted the Babylonian system for pattern recognition across celestial and terrestrial data. By the end of the program, Daniel spoke the language of the empire's most sensitive documents as fluently as its own trained scholars. But what he carried into that training was something Nebuchadnezzar's program could not give him and could not take away: a different framework for interpreting data. And that difference would determine everything that followed. But that was only the beginning. The crisis that revealed Daniel's methodology came in year 2 of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and it came in a form that no one in the Babylonian intelligence apparatus was equipped to handle. The king had a dream. Not a minor dream, not the kind of dream you mention to a priest and forget by afternoon. A dream so vivid, so structurally coherent, so obviously significant that Nebuchadnezzar woke from it in the middle of the night with his heart pounding, certain that it meant something, and equally certain by the morning that he could no longer fully recall its contents.
Of the moon.
He summoned his council, the Chaldean astrologers, the Magi, the enchanters, the entire advisory apparatus of the most powerful empire on earth. And he made a demand that Daniel 2:5 records in language that still reads like a genuine administrative crisis. He told them, "The decree from me is firm. If you do not tell me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be turned into rubble. But if you do tell me the dream and its interpretation, you will receive gifts and rewards and great honor from me." The council's response was immediate and unanimous. They said in Daniel 2:10, "What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among humans." This was the honest answer, but it was not the answer the king wanted. So Nebuchadnezzar issued an execution order. Every wise man in Babylon, every astrologer, every magi, every court interpreter was to be killed, including Daniel and his 3 companions who had recently completed their training and been assigned to the palace staff. The guard came to Daniel's quarters with the order. Daniel asked him one question: why has the king issued such a harsh decree? He was not protesting, he was not fleeing, he was gathering information about the nature and urgency of the problem before formulating a response. Then he went to Nebuchadnezzar and asked for time. Not an indefinite extension, a specific time. Daniel 2:16. Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time so that he might interpret the dream for him. This is the first visible element of the Daniel methodology. He did not commit to an outcome he had not yet achieved. He committed to a timeline within which he would attempt to achieve it. He was not performing confidence. He was managing expectations with the precision of someone who understood the difference between what he knew and what he was about to find out. He went home. He told his 3 companions, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, known in Babylon as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, exactly what the situation was. And then he asked them to pray with him for insight into the mystery the king needed solved. That night, the dream came to Daniel. The vision was clear. A statue of enormous size and brilliance, its head of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet a mixture of iron and clay. A stone cut from a mountain without human hands struck the statue at the feet and shattered it completely. The stone then grew into a mountain that filled the whole earth.
Of the moon.
Daniel woke. He praised God for the answer. And then, and this is the detail most people miss entirely, he did not go immediately to the king. He went first to Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, who had been assigned to carry out the executions. Daniel 2:24. Go and stop the execution of the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I will interpret his dream. He saved his colleagues first, the Babylonian advisors who had told the king the task was impossible, the men who were about to be killed because their methodology had no framework for the problem in front of them. Daniel intervened on their behalf before he presented his own solution. This is the second element of the methodology. He did not use his competitors' failure to advance his own position at their expense. He used his solution to protect them from the consequences of their failure. And in doing so, he demonstrated something to every person in that palace who was watching. He demonstrated that his framework was not simply better at answering questions. It was better at generating outcomes that were good for more than one person. What happened next would rewrite every assumption in the Babylonian advisory system. Nebuchadnezzar received Daniel in the throne room. He asked one question first. Are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it? Daniel's answer in Daniel 2:27-28 is one of the most precise methodological statements in all of ancient literature. And I want you to hear it as a strategic positioning statement, not as a religious claim. He said, "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries." Read what he just did. He acknowledged explicitly that the existing institutional advisory system could not solve this problem. He did not insult them. He did not take credit for a personal superiority. He located the source of his advantage outside himself, in a framework for understanding reality that the Babylonian system did not possess and could not replicate. This is the third element of the methodology. He was transparent about the source of his edge. He was not claiming to be smarter than the Chaldean astrologers. He was claiming access to a different category of information than they were working with. Then he told the king the dream, in detail. The statue, the gold head, the silver chest, the bronze belly, the iron legs, the feet of clay, the stone from the mountain, the wind carrying the fragments away until nothing was left. Nebuchadnezzar had told no one the content of the dream. No description had been circulated. No partial account existed in the court record. The dream was entirely inside the king's memory, and even that memory had partially faded. Daniel described it perfectly. The silence in that throne room must have been unlike anything it had ever held before. Then came the interpretation. The statue represented the succession of world empires, Babylon as the golden head, followed by a succession of lesser powers, each one giving way to the next, until a final kingdom established by God himself would stand forever. The stone from the mountain was not a military force. It was a category of power different from all the kingdoms that had preceded it. Nebuchadnezzar's response in Daniel 2:47 is as close as an ancient Near Eastern king ever came to a complete concession of epistemic authority. He said, "Surely your God is the God of gods, and the Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery." Then he promoted Daniel to ruler over the entire province of Babylon, and placed him as chief prefect over all its wise men. A 17-year-old Jewish exile was now the chief intelligence officer of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But what happened in the years that followed is where the real case study begins. Daniel held his position not for one administration, but for four. Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Darius the Mede, Cyrus the Persian. Four separate empires, four completely different ruling structures, four transitions of power, each one the kind of political disruption that eliminates most of the people who held senior positions under the previous regime. Daniel survived every transition, and in most of them, he was elevated rather than displaced. This is the fact that the management literature has never once examined. The question is not how Daniel got the first position, The question is how he kept operational authority across 4 distinct power structures spanning approximately 70 years. Stay with me, because the answer is in the methodology, and the methodology is visible in the text. In Nebuchadnezzar's case, the king eventually suffered what Daniel 4 describes as a 7-year period of what modern clinicians would identify as severe dissociative psychosis. He lived in the fields, ate grass like an ox, and was effectively non-functional as a ruler. During that period, Daniel continued in his administrative role. When Nebuchadnezzar recovered, Daniel 4:34 through 36 records that the king's advisors and nobles sought him out, meaning the institutional continuity that Daniel had maintained was what held the administrative structure together during the king's incapacity. He had made himself not just individually valuable, but structurally necessary. This is the 4th element of the methodology. He did not position himself as the king's personal interpreter, dependent on the king's favor for his continued relevance. He positioned himself as the connective tissue of the administrative system, the person through whom institutional knowledge passed, who maintained the data infrastructure, who held the interpretive framework that the system could not function without. When Nebuchadnezzar recovered, he had no choice but to restore Daniel to full authority. Because without Daniel, the administrative records of 7 years were uninterpretable. Modern organizations call this knowledge capital, the accumulated, structured, specific understanding of how a complex system works that exists only in the mind of one person, making that person's continued presence not a matter of loyalty, but of operational necessity. Daniel built his knowledge capital deliberately and continuously across every decade he held his position. And when Belshazzar came to power, the son of Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, the opening of Daniel 5 reveals something significant. Belshazzar did not know Daniel. Or rather, he had been told about Daniel, but he had not elevated him. The text says in Daniel 5:13 that the queen mother, almost certainly Nebuchadnezzar's widow, had to remind Belshazzar of Daniel's existence when the handwriting appeared on the wall. The handwriting on the wall. On the night Belshazzar hosted a banquet for 1,000 of his nobles, drinking wine from the sacred vessels looted from the Jerusalem temple, a human hand appeared on the plaster wall of the banquet hall and wrote 4 words in Aramaic: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. The king's face turned pale. His knees knocked together. His legs gave way. He called for every wise man in Babylon. None of them could read it. The queen mother entered the banquet hall and said in Daniel 5:11 through 12, "There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." There is one detail here that almost no one discusses. The queen mother described what Daniel had done under Nebuchadnezzar. She listed his competencies explicitly: insight, intelligence, wisdom. She was making an evidence-based recommendation to a new executive who had overlooked a proven asset because the asset had been associated with the previous administration. This happens in every organizational transition. When a new leader takes power, they tend to promote people who are personally loyal to them and sideline people who are associated with the predecessor,
pocket of the moon,
regardless of competence. Belshazzar had done exactly this with Daniel. But the crisis that his own advisors could not solve forced him to reach for the asset he had ignored. Daniel came. He looked at the writing. He said in Daniel 5:17, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means." He decoupled his analytical service from his compensation. This is a detail that requires careful attention. Every other advisor in that palace operated on a transactional basis. They provided analysis in exchange for rewards, and the quality of the analysis was therefore always shaped by what result the client wanted to hear. Daniel removed the compensation variable from his side of the transaction entirely. He would tell Belshazzar what the writing meant, regardless of whether Belshazzar wanted to hear it, and regardless of what Belshazzar offered him for it. This is the fifth element of the methodology. He maintained analytical independence by removing financial dependency from the relationship between his analysis and his reward. He could not be bought. He could not be pressured. He could not be socially engineered into softening a conclusion, because the conclusion he reached was not connected to the income he received. Modern intelligence theory calls this the principal-agent problem. The agent, in this case the advisor, faces an incentive to tell the principal what the principal wants to hear rather than what is actually true, because the principal controls the agent's compensation. Daniel had eliminated this problem by making his compensation irrelevant to his analysis. Then he read the writing. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. That night, Belshazzar was killed, and Darius the Mede took the kingdom.
What happened next would change how we understand organizational resilience in every era of management history.
Darius the Mede restructured the administrative system. He appointed 120 satraps, regional governors, across the kingdom, and over them 3 administrators. Daniel was appointed as one of the 3. But the text of Daniel 6:3 says something that should stop every executive who reads it. It says Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. His exceptional qualities.
The 8th pocket of the moon.
Not his connections to the previous regime. Not his years of accumulated political relationships. Not his institutional memory, though that was considerable. His qualities. The observable characteristics of how he approached every problem, handled every piece of information, managed every relationship within his authority. The other administrators noticed, and they tried to destroy him. Daniel 6:4. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Read that as an audit. The people trying to remove Daniel from his position conducted what was effectively a complete forensic review of his administrative record. Every decision, every transaction, every piece of correspondence, every allocation of resources under his authority, and they found nothing. Not because Daniel was lucky, not because the records had been destroyed, because there was nothing to find. This is the 6th element of the methodology. He conducted every administrative function as if it were being continuously audited by hostile reviewers with unlimited access to the records. Because he understood that in any system of power, the people who want to remove you will use whatever is in the record to do it. The only protection against that is a clean record. He had been building that record for decades. Every decision documented, every resource accounted for, every conflict of interest avoided before it could be created. Not because he was afraid of an audit, because he understood that the long-term value of a clean record exceeded any short-term benefit available from any single compromised decision. Unable to find grounds in his administrative record, his enemies found another approach. They persuaded Darius to issue a decree that for 30 days no one could pray to any god or human being except to the king. The penalty was death by lions. They knew Daniel prayed 3 times daily facing Jerusalem. They had watched him. They had mapped his habits. They had found the one area of his life where his behavior was predictable enough to be used against him. Daniel knew about the decree. Daniel 6:10 says, "When Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before." Just as he had done before. He did not change his behavior. He did not increase it. He did not suddenly pray 4 times a day in defiance. He did not decrease it. He did not quietly relocate his prayers to a room without windows. He continued exactly as before.
The eighth pocket of
because
the moon.
changing his behavior in response to the decree would have been an acknowledgement that the decree held authority over his practice, and it did not. His enemies found him. They reported him to Darius. The king was trapped. He had signed the decree himself, and the laws of the Medes and Persians could not be revoked, not even by the king who issued them. Daniel was arrested, thrown into the lion's den. A stone was placed over the entrance and sealed with the king's signet ring. And Darius could not sleep. Daniel 6:18. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, Darius went to the den. He called out in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" And Daniel answered, "My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." He was lifted out, and the text says in Daniel 6:23 that no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God.
The men who had accused him, along with their families, were thrown into the den. The lions overpowered them immediately. And Darius issued a decree across every nation and language in his kingdom that people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. Then Daniel 6:28 closes the account with a single line that is the most compressed executive biography in ancient literature. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. 4 empires, 7 decades, 1 unbroken operational record. What happened next was not a continuation of the story. It was the beginning of its legacy. The Babylonian system that Daniel operated within has left physical evidence that modern archaeology is still deciphering. In 2024, scholars at the University of London, Professor Andrew George and independent researcher Junko Taniguchi completed the first full translation of 4 Babylonian cuneiform tablets held at the British Museum. The tablets, the oldest known from Babylon, dated to nearly 4,000 years ago. What they contained were omen texts, systematic records connecting celestial observations to earthly predictions. When the moon fully slips into the earth's shadow, a king shall die. A large army will fall. There will be an attack on the land by a locust swarm.
The eighth pocket of the moon.
These were not superstitions. They were the Babylonian government's operating system for strategic decision-making. The observation of celestial portents, as the scholars noted in their analysis, was a serious business for the body politic. Astrological observation was part of an elaborate method of protecting the king and regulating his behavior in conformity with the wishes of the gods. The Tupsar Enuma, Anu, and Lil, the scribes of the Omen series, maintained what historians now call one of the longest continuous research programs ever undertaken. The astronomical diaries, tracking planetary movements from at least the 7th century BC forward, represent a data collection effort sustained across multiple generations without interruption. The British Museum currently holds fragments that help scientists understand historical geomagnetic activity with precision not available from any other ancient source.
Daniel worked within this system. He read these tablets. He trained on this literature. He understood the data and the methodology that the Babylonian intelligence apparatus had spent generations developing. And then he consistently outperformed it. The question that has never been adequately addressed in management literature is why? Not theologically, operationally. What was the structural difference between Daniel's analytical methodology and the methodology of the Chaldean astrologers that allowed him to produce correct answers in situations where the institutional experts produced nothing? There are three differences that the text makes visible. The first, the Babylonian system was pattern-based. It connected observable phenomena, celestial events, to predicted outcomes based on historical correlations. When event A occurred, outcome B had previously followed, so outcome B was predicted when event A recurred. This is what modern data science calls correlational modeling. It can be extraordinarily powerful when the underlying causal structure is stable. But it fails completely when the causal structure changes, when something happens that has no historical precedent in the data set. Nebuchadnezzar's dream was precisely this kind of problem. It was not a celestial event. It had no historical precedent in the omen literature. The Babylonian system's pattern matching engine had no entry for it. The council said, correctly, that their methodology could not answer this question. Daniel's framework was not correlational. It was something the ancient world did not have a management term for, and that modern intelligence theory calls structural analysis, identifying the underlying causal logic of a situation rather than matching it to historical patterns. He was not asking what has happened before when conditions like this existed. He was asking what is actually happening here, and what does the internal logic of this situation determine will follow. The second difference. The Babylonian system was designed to tell the king what the gods intended. Its function was interpretive, to translate divine communication into human language. This meant that its output was always framed as received wisdom rather than derived analysis. The astrologers were not reasoning to conclusions. They were reporting revelations. Daniel was reasoning to conclusions and then acknowledging the source of the reasoning capacity. He never claimed personal credit for the analysis, but he also never presented his conclusions as unchallengeable revelation. He presented them as answers, specific, testable, verifiable against the reality that followed. This made him accountable in a way the Babylonian system was not. If the astrologers predicted a king would die and a king did not die, the prediction could be reinterpreted, the timeline adjusted, the omen text reread. If Daniel said Babylon's kingdom would fall to the Medes and Persians, and Babylon's kingdom did not fall to the Medes and Persians, there was no reinterpretation available. He had staked his credibility on a specific, falsifiable claim. He chose falsifiability over protection from being wrong. This is the most consequential difference, because it meant that every time he was right, and the record shows he was consistently right, his credibility compounded. Not the credibility of the institution he worked within, his personal analytical credibility. The track record that made 4 consecutive rulers want him in their innermost advisory circle regardless of what else had changed. The third difference is the one that the text emphasizes most heavily, and that modern management theory has the hardest time incorporating. Daniel maintained a practice, consistent, daily, non-negotiable, that operated completely outside the palace system. 3 times a day, facing Jerusalem, he reconnected with a frame of reference that was larger than Babylon. This is not a theological point, it is an organizational one. Every intelligence system creates a gravitational field that pulls the analysts inside it toward the assumptions, the vocabulary, the incentive structures, and the blind spots of the institution itself. The longer an analyst operates inside a single system, the more their thinking conforms to the shape of that system. This is what intelligence scholars call mirror imaging. the tendency to interpret data through the lens of one's own institutional assumptions rather than through the actual logic of the situation being analyzed. Daniel's daily practice was, among other things, a systematic defense against mirror imaging. It was a deliberate reconnection with a framework that existed entirely outside the Babylonian institutional structure, a framework that maintained his capacity to see the system from outside it, even while he operated within it. The analysts who told Nebuchadnezzar that no one could reveal the dream except the gods were correct about one thing. They were working entirely within the Babylonian system's frame. They could not see outside it. Daniel could. Not because he was smarter, because he had built and maintained a practice that kept his analytical frame larger than the institution he worked for. And that practice cost him his life, or appeared to, and then returned it. There is one final layer to the Daniel algorithm that every person building an organization or a career needs to understand before they try to apply the rest of it. Daniel did not operate in a favorable environment. He was never, at any point across his 70-year career, in a situation that was designed to support his success. He was a captive in a foreign empire. He served kings who were capable of executing him on a moment's notice, and who had, in at least 2 cases, issued orders to do exactly that. He operated within an advisory system that was structurally hostile to his framework and that spent decades trying to find grounds to remove him. He never confused his circumstances with his capacity. This is the piece of the methodology that cannot be taught in a classroom or extracted from a case study. It can only be observed in the record of someone who actually did it. And the record of Daniel is one of the clearest demonstrations in all of ancient literature that circumstances do not determine outcomes. Methodology does. The pit does not determine the palace. The training program for captives does not determine the appointment as chief administrator. The lion's den does not determine whether Daniel prospers in the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus. What determines those outcomes is the consistent application of a methodology that does not change based on the environment it operates in, that produces the same quality of analysis regardless of who is asking for it or what they want to hear, that maintains the same behavioral standards whether the king is watching or the king is in a field eating grass, that protects the same people in the moment of crisis, whether protecting them serves Daniel's interests or not. The Babylonian astronomical diaries tracked the movements of planets for centuries. They built one of the most sophisticated data collection systems the ancient world ever produced. They developed pattern libraries that modern scientists still use to reconstruct historical astronomical events. And they could not tell Nebuchadnezzar what he had dreamed. Daniel could. Not because Daniel had better data, because Daniel had a better framework for understanding what data is for. The ancient cuneiform tablets now held in the British Museum still carry the Babylonian system's centuries of careful observation. 4 of the oldest were finally fully translated in 2024 by scholars at the University of London. They contain omens, predictions, pattern correlations between celestial events and earthly outcomes. They are extraordinary documents. They are also the record of a methodology that Daniel consistently beat. Every organization you will ever build will have its own Babylonian system, its own institutional assumptions, its own pattern library, its own way of framing problems that feels like the only way to frame them because everyone around you is framing them the same way. The Daniel algorithm is not a technique. It is a posture. It is the posture of someone who operates at the highest level of an institution while maintaining a frame of reference that is larger than the institution, who produces analysis that is accountable rather than protected, who builds a behavioral record that hostile auditors cannot find fault with, who decouples the quality of his analysis from the size of his reward, who does not change his practice when the environment punishes him for it, who walks into the lion's den with the same unhurried step he used to cross the throne room. Because the step is the methodology, and the methodology does not change based on what is waiting at the other end of the walk.